Well, much has been made of the parliamentary reform proposed by the independent country MPs. Labor's already signed on for it and the coalition is deep in deliberation over the issue this afternoon. Joining me now to discuss the promises and pitfalls of parliamentary reform is the ABC's election analyst Antony Green. Antony, as we just said, the government's agreed to Rob Oakeshott's wish list for reform. Let's go through some of them. 30-second questions and a 3-minute limit on answers. I know quite often the answers are at least double that. But is it about time or is it about quality?
To some extent it's about quality. One of the problems, I think, with the House of Representatives is ever since they've been broadcast, the question time has become the moment where the opposition and the government are trying to get their grabs up for camera.
You're not saying they're playing to the camera.
They're playing to the camera to an extent. And the role of it has become much more theatrical and built around television, and people make interjections and noise, and the atmospherics are all about knowing that grabs are going to be used from it for the evening news bulletin. And that's been one of the things that's undermined question time. And generally, the Parliament has become less important as a forum for announcements. Once upon a time, if the government had a big announcement, it would do it in a speech to the Parliament. Nowadays, they'll go and do a press club lunch instead. Up until 1990, elections were always announced on the floor of House of Representatives. Now they're always done at a press conference. So we've seen many of the roles which were once done by Parliament being done outside of the Parliament.
So if you have to have sharper questions or shorter questions and shorter answers, does it necessarily mean that it's going to be a better process?
I think that what you'll find is the ministers they'll be less dissembling. They'll have to actually answer the question more directly. They're used to doing it in the Senate and have done for a number of years, where they have a shorter question and answer period. But I think we'll see how it works in the House. But again, I think people shouldn't expect question time to be the point where a government is accountable. Question time doesn't keep government accountable. What's far more important, I think, in the changes that are being proposed is things like the use of committees, in the same way the Senate has done that for years.
Well let's have a look at the committee system. They're calling it a sort of turbocharged committee system, and it's not just the makeup of the committees, but it's also the requirement that governments respond to committee reports. How different will that be to what happens now?
Well, Australia is different from other Westminster systems, that in the lower houses of Parliament the numbers are very tight. The government always controls its numbers, the opposition controls its numbers, and governments have tended to treat lower houses of Australian parliaments quite badly. If you go to New Zealand, the whole legislative process is taken very seriously. All bills go off to committees and the committees are reviewed and they come back with reports suggesting amendments. It's taken very seriously. The government in Australia nowadays doesn't brook any amendments in the lower house. That's done in the Senate, and everything's left to the Senate. What is interesting, if this is done seriously in the House, what you may find is that the bill comes out of the House with the agreed amendments from the opposition and the government. This may actually diminish the role of the Senate in this current term.
And that would have ramifications for the Greens.
It would have ramifications for the Greens because the opposition and government may have agreed on the bill before it gets to the Senate. The opposition may continue that process of attacking a bill in the Senate, but the process has been gone through in the House, where currently none of the detailed addressing of amendments and the detailed addressing of how legislation will work is really done these days until you get to the Senate, because that's where the government doesn't control the numbers.
Well, how will it change? Like, what exactly will be the mechanism that will make the committees that much more efficient? Will they still be made up of representation from both the government and the opposition according to the numbers on the floor?
We have seen this in many of the state parliaments have introduced estimates committees for the lower house, and to an extent they haven't been hugely successful because these sorts of committees really only work with good input that's involved, and if it becomes a point scoring exercise between the two sides of politics, the committees can get bogged down. Some Senate committees have had the same problem. If the legislative committees are done properly, they can be very useful if both sides of politics take them seriously. One of the difficulties in Australia is there's never been seen in the lower house, in the House of Representatives, the aim has always been to get into the cabinet. The ability to take on chair of committees has not been seen as a hugely important job.
So what's in this reform that will change that?
Well, I think it will work in the current Parliament. What you may find is in the future, when governments regain control of the lower house of Parliament, this sort of work atrophied. In the same way that when the Howard government controlled the Senate, committees became much less important. Governments would hold committee hearings, which had 1 day's of hearings, then reported 2 weeks later. So they went through the process of having the Senate committees, but they didn't take them as seriously when they had the Senate numbers. This reform may work for this Parliament, but trying to institutionalise them so they're done seriously in future Parliaments when governments regain control, that'll be another matter. Some of the reforms which have come in, say, the New South Wales Parliament after the independents gained control, like extra resources for the library and those sorts of administrative areas, those reforms stayed. but the actual reforms to the parliamentary procedures tended to sort of disappear.
Because the other, I suppose, significant reform is a parliamentary budget office, and not just to provide fiscal analysis and independent costings, but also to provide research for all MPs. It could become a very valuable office, and I assume that if that was set up, that's something that would possibly last.
That's something that's become very important, and what you find is that the Parliament introduces legislation, but members also get vast documents from the Parliamentary Library which detail the bill, the legislative documents which come with it. This would sort of do the same sort of thing in the economic area, and it's very important, and members like that because they deal with correspondence all the time, and to have documents which have details that they can provide in answer to constituents is always a very useful document for them to have, and it's certainly of great benefit to crossbenchers and opposition members who don't normally have access to government departments.
You talked before about how some of these changes might last but prove durable and some won't. To what extent do you need to legislate or mandate parliamentary reform, and to what extent can you just rely on convention? For example, pairing.
There are constitutional difficulties in trying to sort of legislate some of these things, but they will. But the problem in Australia is we have very strict party rules. Members do not cross the floor. If you compare it with the House of Commons in Britain, where they have quite a free-flowing question time, there is no ties. Labor members, there are occasions when Tony Blair's bills survived on the support of the opposition Conservatives with his own backbenching revolt. That sort of thing is unknown in Australia because we have very strict party rules when people vote. That's not about to be undone. The executive in Australia is used to being able to control the lower house of Parliament. It will occasionally abide not being in that position, but long term it tends to be undermined. The things that will come out of this are the additional resources to Parliament. I suspect the Parliamentary Budget Office, those things will survive because all members will find that useful. But I think the actual chamber itself, trying to get these changes to last into the future are very difficult. And also, of course, once the government's got control of the lower house, the question again will become the Senate. And I suspect what will happen is in this term of Parliament, House committees will become much more important than Senate committees. But once a government has control of the House again, you'll see the resurgence of the Senate committees again.